The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect in the middle of an old forest in Oregon. It was oppressive, unnatural, like the entire world had been wrapped in cotton. Not a bird, not a rustling leaf, not even the distant hum of a car on a far-off road. Just me, standing alone in the clearing, staring at the peculiar tree. The bark was blackened, as if scorched by fire, but the surrounding woods were untouched, vibrant even. Its branches twisted unnaturally toward the sky, clawing at the heavens like the skeletal hands of something desperate. And then there were the carvings, deep, deliberate etchings of symbols I didn't recognize, winding up the trunk like a spiraling curse. I didn't know why, but my pulse quickened. Something about that tree made my skin crawl, made the air feel heavier with each breath. And just as I turned to leave, I swear I heard it whisper, "Don't go." That morning had started as ordinary as any other. My name is Joshua Carter if we're being formal, and I'm just a regular guy from Portland. 32, divorced, and currently taking a very unwanted break from work. My boss, a perpetually angry man named Greg, had suggested I take some time to figure things out. Apparently, my recent outbursts weren't professional. So, I packed a bag and drove out to the countryside, hoping the woods could do what therapy and whiskey couldn't, clear my head. I ended up renting a cabin near the base of Blackridge Forest, a sprawling wilderness with a bad reputation. Locals called it the Forest of No Return. The stories were colorful, hunters disappearing without a trace, hikers finding themselves hopelessly lost for days before emerging babbling about shadowy figures and voices that called them deeper into the trees. I didn't believe in ghost stories. I just needed quiet, somewhere far from the relentless buzz of the city. The cabin itself was charming enough, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch overlooking a tranquil lake. It wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary. The kind of place where the most dangerous thing you'd encounter would be a raccoon in your garbage. At least, that's what I thought. The day passed uneventfully. I chopped some wood, read a few chapters of a battered Stephen King novel, and cooked a pathetic excuse for dinner. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a golden glow, I felt an unexpected pang of unease. It started small, a shadow darting across the porch, barely noticeable. Then the feeling of being watched crept in. I chalked it up to nerves, city boy jitters in the middle of nowhere. But then the lights flickered. I froze, my eyes darting to the lamp in the corner as it dimmed and buzzed back to life. Just old wiring, I told myself. Nothing sinister. But the unease lingered, settling like a weight in my chest. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The bed in the cabin's lone bedroom was surprisingly comfortable, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind raced with fragments of thought, work, my ex-wife, that stupid argument I had with Greg. And then there was the forest, stretching endlessly beyond the cabin walls, its dark edges pressing against the windows like a living thing. Somewhere deep in those woods, that cursed tree waited. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off, my last conscious thought a silent promise. Tomorrow, I'd explore the forest, prove to myself there was nothing to fear. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I woke to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, a faint scraping, like nails against wood, coming from the porch. The clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m., its digital display flickering weakly. The room was bathed in an eerie half-light from the moon outside, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, a deliberate, rhythmic scrape. My mind scrambled for rational explanations, a tree branch blown against the railing, maybe an animal nosing around for scraps. But the uneasy weight in my chest told me otherwise. I slid out of bed, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The cabin felt colder than before, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in my sleep. My breath clouded in front of me, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. "Probably nothing," I muttered under my breath, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. I crept toward the front door, every step punctuated by the groaning protest of the old wooden floor. When I reached the door, I paused, hand hovering over the lock. The scraping had stopped. For a moment, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. And then, 3 deliberate knocks. I stumbled back, my grip tightening around the flashlight. The knocks weren't frantic or aggressive. They were slow, measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had all the time in the world. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Gathering what little courage I could muster, I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the flashlight onto the porch. It was empty. The beams swept across the wooden planks, revealing nothing but an overturned chair and the faint remnants of frost creeping up the railing. But then I noticed the footprints. They weren't human, too large, with clawed toes that left deep impressions in the frost. The tracks led down the steps and disappeared into the trees. My stomach turned as I realized they weren't leading away from the cabin. They were leading toward it. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood as if that flimsy barrier could protect me. My mind raced, grappling with the absurdity of the situation. Maybe it was some kind of animal, a bear, perhaps. But deep down, I knew better. Those tracks belonged to something else, something unnatural. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless paranoia. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a threat. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting by the door, flashlight clutched tightly in my hands. Determined not to let my imagination get the better of me, I decided to investigate the forest. Maybe if I could find a logical explanation for the tracks, I could shake the lingering sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The woods felt different in the daylight. They were still vast and imposing, but the sunlight filtering through the trees gave them an almost tranquil beauty. I followed the tracks as they wound deeper into the forest, their clawed impressions cutting through patches of frost-covered grass and damp earth. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves gradually faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness that felt almost alive. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, until I found myself standing in a familiar clearing. The tree was there, its blackened bark and twisted branches even more menacing in the pale light. The carvings seemed to shimmer faintly, as if the symbols were alive, shifting under my gaze. The footprints ended abruptly at its base, as though whatever had made them had simply vanished. I hesitated, a deep primal instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, pushed me forward. As I approached the tree, I noticed something glinting among the roots. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt to reveal a small, rusted object. It was a locket, the kind you'd find at an antique shop, with intricate engravings on its surface. I opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, her face serene but her eyes haunted. Beneath the photo was an inscription. To Eleanor. Forever yours. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and I could have sworn I heard my name whispered on the breeze. Josh! I spun around, heart pounding, but the clearing was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. Josh! The voice was soft, almost familiar, but there was something off about it, an unnatural cadence that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. As I scrambled to my feet, the carvings on the tree began to glow, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the whispers. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight, and the metallic scent from the cabin returned, sharper and more nauseating. Suddenly, the light from the tree flared, and for a brief moment, I saw something in its shadow, an impossibly tall figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. And then it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Clutching the locket, I ran. The forest blurred around me, trees twisting and warping in my peripheral vision. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening cacophony in my ears. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing by the cabin, the whispers stopped. I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath, the locket still clutched tightly in my hand. As I sat there, trembling, I realized one thing with terrifying clarity. Whatever was in that forest, it wasn't done with me yet. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, every nerve in my body stretched taut. The locket sat on the table in front of me, its tarnished surface catching the flickering light of the fireplace. I couldn't stop staring at the photograph, the young woman's eyes boring into mine as if begging me to understand something I couldn't quite grasp. I needed answers. The name, Eleanor, felt like a thread dangling from a tapestry of dread, and I had to pull it. I grabbed my laptop, hoping the spotty Wi-Fi in the cabin would cooperate. To my surprise, it did. A quick search for Eleanor Blackridge Forest brought up an unsettling number of results. Eleanor Martin, missing 1973. Last seen hiking with her fiancé in Blackridge Forest. Another search pulled up a news clipping from 1986. Local teen found dead in Blackridge, clutching locket linked to missing woman. And then another, dated 1999. Experienced hiker vanishes in Blackridge. Final journal entry mentions the tree. My pulse quickened as a grim pattern emerged. Every few years, someone disappeared in or near the forest, often leaving behind cryptic clues tied to that damn tree. Some were experienced outdoorsmen, others just curious locals or wanderers like me. But they all had one thing in common: none of them were ever found. I looked back at the locket, my stomach twisting. Was it a message? A warning? Or worse, an invitation? Before I could think further, a knock shattered the silence. I froze. It was the same slow, deliberate rhythm as before, 3 measured knocks. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight. I swung the beam toward the sound, and my blood turned to ice. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, not human, not entirely. Its features were elongated, stretched almost beyond recognition, with pale, translucent skin and black, bottomless eyes. The mouth moved, but the sound that followed wasn't a voice. It was a guttural, otherworldly rasp that scraped against my sanity. "Josh!" I stumbled back, tripping over the chair and crashing to the floor. When I looked up, the face was gone. I didn't think. I acted. Grabbing my jacket and the locket, I bolted out the door and into the forest, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had been at the window. The cold night air bit into my skin, and the darkness pressed in around me like a living thing. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and twisted branches, but the locket seemed to guide me. I followed an unexplainable pull, each step taking me deeper into the woods until I reached the clearing. The cursed tree loomed before me, its carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers returned, soft at first, then rising to a deafening crescendo. They were everywhere, swirling around me, overlapping voices that spoke in an ancient, guttural tongue. I felt my knees buckle as the whispers coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. The tree wasn't just cursed, it was alive. A parasite, feeding on the souls of the lost, drawing them into its grasp and binding them forever. I staggered forward, clutching the locket like a talisman, as the ground beneath me began to tremble. The symbols on the tree's bark pulsed, and the shadowy figure from before emerged once again, stepping out from the trunk as if it had been part of the wood all along. It was taller than any human, its body impossibly thin, and its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless now, a smooth expanse of pale flesh save for the void-like eyes that burned into mine. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. The figure raised an elongated hand, pointing at the locket in my grip. The whispers surged, and in that moment, I understood. The locket wasn't a key to escaping, it was a tether, binding me to the tree's will. The only way to break free was to destroy it. But doing so wouldn't just sever my connection, it would unleash whatever malevolent force the tree had been holding back. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heatwaves on asphalt. I could feel its presence in my mind, prying into my thoughts, my memories, my fears. "Choose," the whispers demanded. With trembling hands I hurled the locket at the tree. The moment it struck the bark, a blinding light erupted, accompanied by a sound that was neither a scream nor a roar but something far more ancient and incomprehensible. The ground split open, and I was thrown back, landing hard on the frozen earth. The tree writhed as if in agony, its branches twisting and snapping, and the figure dissolved into a black mist that swirled upward before vanishing into the night. Then silence. The clearing was still. The tree stood charred and lifeless, its carvings gone, its branches limp. I staggered to my feet, my entire body trembling. The locket was nowhere to be seen, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air felt lighter. I stumbled back toward the cabin, the forest eerily quiet around me. By the time I reached the porch, dawn was breaking, casting a warm glow over the landscape. But as I stepped inside, I froze. The table where the locket had been was empty, but carved into the wood were 3 words, jagged and deep. "You brought it." The twist, unforgettable revelation. The words carved into the table, "You brought it," felt like a punch to the chest. I stared at them, my mind scrambling for meaning, but the letters were stark and jagged, mocking me in their simplicity. The locket was gone. The tree was lifeless. It was over. It had to be. But then why did I feel heavier? Why did my body feel like it was sinking into the floor, as if the air around me had turned to molasses? I forced myself to look away, my gaze drifting to the cabin's lone window. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the forest in hues of gold and amber. It looked peaceful, serene even, but the sense of dread coiled tighter around my chest. Something was wrong. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the cabin. My hand froze on the doorknob. The forest was gone. Not literally. I could see the trees standing tall, their branches swaying in the wind. But the forest I had entered days ago, the one that had felt alive, oppressive, and consuming, was no longer there. In its place was something sterile and still, like a painting that had lost its depth. The trees no longer whispered or creaked. The shadows didn't shift. It was too quiet. And then it hit me, the silence wasn't outside. It was inside. I couldn't hear the hum of my own breath or the thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. I clapped my hands together, hard, but the sound was swallowed by a void. My scream followed suit, my throat burning with the effort, but no sound came out. Panic clawed at me as I stumbled back, my legs hitting the chair by the table. That's when I noticed the clock. It had stopped. The hands were frozen at 3:17 a.m., the exact moment I'd heard the scraping at the window. I stared at it, willing it to tick, but the second hand remained still. My breath came faster, shallow gasps that didn't seem to fill my lungs. Then I saw the mirror. It hung above the fireplace, an old, warped piece of glass framed in ornate wood. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but now, something about it felt wrong. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but there was a flicker, so fast I almost missed it. I stepped closer. The flicker came again. It wasn't me. The face in the mirror was mine, but the movements were off, fractionally delayed, like a glitch in a video feed. My reflection tilted its head, a fraction of a second after I did, its eyes narrowing ever so slightly. I raised a trembling hand to the glass, and my reflection mirrored me, until it didn't. It smiled. Not my smile. Not even close. It was a jagged, unnatural grin that stretched too far, splitting my reflection's face in ways no human face should move. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair, and the grin grew wider, impossibly wide, until the skin cracked and bled. "Josh," it whispered, the sound clawing its way into my mind despite the silence that had consumed the cabin. "You brought it here." I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing even though I still couldn't hear it. The reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface as its voice grew louder, more insistent. "You brought it. You opened the door." "What door?" I shouted, my voice echoing in my head like a distant memory. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it pressed its face against the glass, the cracks spreading like veins, until the entire mirror shattered outward. Shards of glass rained down around me, but instead of scattering, they floated, hovering in the air like frozen raindrops. And in the broken fragments I saw it. Not just the tree, but the forest. The symbols. The figures. Faces, hundreds of them, screaming silently, their mouths open wide in agony. They weren't just trapped, they were watching me. The largest shard floated closer, and I saw my reflection again. But this time, it wasn't smiling. It was pleading. It mouthed one word, over and over. "Run." The cabin groaned, the walls bowing inward as if the entire structure were being swallowed. I lunged for the door, throwing it open, and ran. The forest wasn't still anymore. It was alive, but not the way it had been before. The trees leaned toward me, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground shifted under my feet, soft and wet like flesh. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a frenzied chant that I couldn't escape. I didn't stop running until I burst out into a clearing, gasping for air. The sunlight hit me, warm and real, and for a moment I thought I was safe. Then I saw the cabin. It stood in the middle of the clearing, identical to the one I had just fled. The same wood-paneled walls, the same stone chimney. And standing in the doorway, framed by the morning light, was me. Not just me. The thing wearing my face. It grinned, raising a hand to wave, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't outside the forest. I was inside it. The cabin wasn't my refuge, it was my cage. The locket, the tree, the whispers, they weren't warnings. They were a trap. And I had walked right into it. As the other me stepped forward, the forest closed in around me, its shadows swallowing the clearing whole. And for the first time, I understood. No one ever leaves the forest. Because the forest is them.